Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Jemar Tisby. Jemar is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the Church's Complicity in Racism, and also How to Fight Racism, and also How to Fight Racism Young Readers Edition. His new book is The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. He's also the professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky in Louisville and has been a co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast since its inception 7 years ago. His writing has been featured in the Washington Post, Atlantic, the New York Times, among other places. He's a frequent commentator on outlets such as NPR, CNN's New Day program, and he speaks nationwide on the topics of racial justice, U.S. history, and Christianity. Jemar earned his PhD in history and he studies race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. He's also contributed to one of our How to Heal Our Divides books. Thank you so much. And we've previously interviewed Jemar about his other great books. But you can follow all of his work on his newsletter, Footnotes, and through his website, jemartisby.com. So Jemar, it's so great to see you again. Really glad to see this new book coming out.
Thank you so much for having me again. Good to see you too.
So is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you besides what I kind of touched on briefly there?
The web address for the newsletter is jemartisby.substack.com. I always tell people, it takes years to write a book. So if you want to hear from me in between, you can follow me at jemartisby.substack.com. A lot of fun election coverage, all the topics, as if race and religion wasn't controversial enough, throwing some politics in there too.
Good, good, good. So it's been, a couple of years since we last talked to you from your last book. So could you catch people up on, what you've been up to over the last couple of years besides writing a book? But
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things. I encourage people to do this. I'm less consistent than I want to be, but it's essentially a gratitude journal. And so I try to do it nightly, just quick bullet points in Evernote. But that is the way I try to keep track of so much that's happening every day, right? So I think the biggest shifts are I've lived in the deep South for my entire adult life. And just in the past year and a half, we transitioned from the Delta area of Arkansas up to Louisville, Kentucky to teach at Simmons College, which has a really neat story. It's a historically black college founded by Black Baptist ministers in 1879 and just has a mission to serve Black students, and it's also faith-based. And so I get to talk about the role of faith and justice together at the school. I teach African American history. And yeah, I've just been working on trying to bring clarity and honesty about our racial landscape, both past and present, to folks through various means. I'm very online, probably too online, but yeah, just
I think
continuing the
it's great.
trajectory.
I'm glad you are. I mean, that's the way we communicate these days, and allows you to have a direct relationship with your audience as opposed to intermediaries.
Right,
So
exactly.
now everybody else is doing the same thing, so it's a bit noisy, but but it does allow you to have those kinds of relationships, which I think is you've done well at. So congratulations on that.
Appreciate you.
So again, let's get into the new book. The Spirit of Justice, Truth Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. So can you tell folks how this came about?
You know, that phrase, the spirit of justice, really stuck with me from an event in December of 2017. It was during the grand opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, and Myrlie Evers Williams spoke there. Now, she is, of course, the spouse of Medgar Evers, who was killed in front of their home in 1963. And she's coming back to the same city where that happened. And it didn't occur to me until later, but she had taken a tour of the museum, and that museum has on display the very rifle used to kill her husband. And that
Mm,
just gave me chills to realize. So
mm.
she gave these public remarks, but then afterwards she had a smaller press conference that I was present at. And I'm so glad I was, because there was a journalist there who asked her, how does the racial justice landscape now compare to during the civil rights movement? And she said something very disturbing. She said she's seeing a lot now that she saw then.
Mm,
That the patterns, the racism, the opposition that was present in the civil rights movement, it looks different, but there's echoes of it even in the 21st century. And then she said, I'm weary. Of
mm,
course, she was in her 80s at the time, and she's still alive as we record this, but she's in her 80s even in 2017. And I fully expected her to say, and it's up to the next generation. I'm passing the baton. But she didn't even say that. She said, but it's something about the spirit of justice
mm,
that makes you determined all over again. My mind was blown in that moment because how can somebody who not only has lived so long, she was in her ninth decade of life, but also had her husband stolen from her for simply working for voting rights. How could she have that resilience and that resolve to to keep going even when, 50, 60 years later, they're still facing some of the same issues. And I said, what kind of people is this? And it occurred to me that phrase really was the key, the spirit of justice. And so
mm,
that
mm,
inspired
mm.
this book about all these stories.
Wow, that's really cool. That it's like I've had plenty of conversations with other people about how God speaks to us,
Mm.
and in my own life, it's so often experiences. Kind of like what you described,
Yes. Yes.
experiences or interaction with other people. And so that's fascinating that that particular instance had such an impact on you to, obviously make a major decision point in your life to go write a book about it.
Yeah, and it was so striking to me, like Murray Evers Williams is a force of nature. I mean, to be in her presence, like I describe in the opening line of the book that age had confined her to a wheelchair, but the way she sat, it was like she was on a throne. And that's one of these things, man. One of the reasons I loved living in the Deep South was you had so many people who had lived through the civil rights movement, whether they were activists or not, right? But they've seen some things and they had survived them and they had made sense of them, many of them making sense through faith. And when you're in the presence of those folks, they don't have to say a thing, but you sense their gravity. You sense their experience. You sense their wisdom. And she had that. And it occurred to me, there are others who have it too. And that in every era of history, there's always been racism. There's always been this concept of white supremacy in the US context. And unfortunately, evil is unsurprising. It's terrible, it's tragic, it's devastating, but it's predictable to a certain degree. To me, what's truly remarkable is that in every age and every era, against all kinds of obstacles, there are also people willing to resist injustice. And
Mhm.
that's who I wanted to write about in this book, the people
It's,
who throughout time carried that spirit of justice.
so share with folks some of the people that you included in the book.
Oh, wow. There's more than 50 figures profiled in this book. I was glad to introduce some new people to a lot of folks. So on the cover is Reverend E.C. Morris, Elias Camp Morris, who just so happened to pastor Centennial Baptist Church, which was in the same town where I used to live in the Delta region of
Mm.
Arkansas. And the reason he's significant is in terms of his work, he was the first president of the National Baptist Convention, USA Inc., which is the largest organization of Black Christians in the country. And for from 1895 until his death in 1922, he was the first president of this enduring institution that has such a major impact
Mm.
on American religious history. And most people don't know his name,
Yeah.
let alone recognize his picture. So he's one of them.
Mm.
I wrote about H. Ford Douglass, no relation to Frederick Douglass, but H. Ford Douglass was a Black man who was biracial because his slaveholder was his father, and he was light-skinned enough to pass as white, which sometimes Black people did, usually to gain the privileges of whiteness.
Mhm.
But that's not what H. Ford Douglass did. During the Civil War, H. Ford Douglass passed as white so he could fight in the Union Army.
Mm, mm,
Before the Emancipation Proclamation, black soldiers were not allowed to enlist. And so he wanted to fight in the Civil War so bad on the side of the Union that he pretended that he was white so he could enroll in the army. Now, it was kind of an open secret that he was biracial. And as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't only declare emancipation for enslaved people in the Confederate States, it also said that black people could join the Union Army. As soon as the proclamation went into effect, he, officially declared, "Hey, I'm black," and then went out and raised his own unit of black soldiers. So
mm, mm,
there's
mm.
tons and tons of stories, as well as recognizable figures. Harriet Tubman is in there, but I don't write about her on the Underground Railroad. I write about her as a Union Army spy and the leader of the Combahee River Raid, where she freed in one night more than all the people combined than she freed on the Underground Railroad.
Wow.
Um, I've got a whole chapter on Martin Luther King Jr. called Beyond the Quotable King. And I talk
Mm,
about King as a preacher. I talk about what nonviolence really meant, because it's not this passive thing that people misinterpret it as. I even talk about the speech, the I Have a Dream speech, and all the other parts of the speech beyond that one quote about the color of skin and content of character. On and on and on. And I just had so much fun researching these folks, and I hope people find it both informative and inspirational.
well, it's nice. It's so tied to your work too, right? I mean, your scholarly work, so.
Yeah, I mean, I really had this book in mind even when I was writing The Color of Compromise, because,
Mm, mm,
to put it simply, Color of Compromise is about white Christians behaving badly when it comes to race. And throughout the whole time researching that book and writing it, and these were stories that we needed to tell, history that we needed to contend with, but I was always kind of saying in the back of my mind, but there's another side to this.
mm.
There's another part of this story that we also need to know, which is the Black Christian tradition. This tradition that really arose in opposition to racism and white supremacy. Because as I say in The Color of Compromise, there would be no Black church without racism in the white church, by which I mean these weren't like doctrinal disputes over the deity of Christ or the Trinity or something like that. The reason why Black people felt compelled to start their own churches and denominations was they didn't want to be treated as second-class citizens in the household of God. And so it really, as a ecclesiastical tradition, rose in opposition to and as a statement against the racism, the white supremacy, the inequality that they were experiencing in many white churches.
So let's talk about some of the common threads, that go through the book, the different people in the book. One is what you call a pattern of endurance.
Hmm. So look, these folks, they just didn't give up. All right, so there's this story about Elizabeth Keckley, who is a fascinating figure. She's also biracial. Her father's her enslaver. Um, but she's a dressmaker. And she gets so good that essentially she becomes a dressmaker to the elite. She ends up toward the back half of her career as the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife, and she's in the White House, right? And so she's in those circles. But before she gets there, she's a household enslaved person. And in terms of the resilience, right? Uh, she was passed along to different white slaveholders who tried to beat her into submission, just like physically whip her. She fought back. She fought back against not one, but two of these men who were trying to whip her in submission over the course of several months. And she refused to cry or scream out. She argued with them. She physically resisted them, and she broke them. She got these grown men to break down in tears and realize that what they were doing was wrong, that they weren't just, they weren't dealing with an animal that they were trying to break from bad habits. They were dealing with a human being. And she went on from that. to start her own business. And then she went on from that. When she had her business stable, she realized that white folks, she was living in Washington, D.C., white folks were raising money for white Union soldiers for the various needs that they had as veterans. Maybe they were injured, to take care of their, families at home, whatever it be. And she said, well, if white folks can do that for their soldiers, black folks can do it for ours.
Mm,
So it's this mind-boggling to me. Black
mm,
people already didn't have much, and yet they organized and came together to take what little they had and put it all together and support people who had even less. And so she came up with this, nonprofit, and this charitable organization to help recently freed people because they were emancipated from the chains of slavery, but they were put into the shackles of poverty. And
mm.
so she used her connections and her church and her fundraising ability to raise funds for these recently freed people. Just, the resilience is all throughout this history. And one of the things I say in the book, you don't have to be stronger, smarter, have more money. You just have to never stop, never stopping. Like ultimately nothing can beat a people who just won't quit. That's why a stone can be eroded by water. It takes a long, long time, but it happens. Like it changes the shape even of the hardest surfaces. And that's what we're seeing throughout decades and centuries of the Black Christian tradition and the Black freedom struggle. All these ways that we've resisted, both big and small, have changed the shape and the contours of our nation.
Well, it's great that you're lifting up some of these role models. You know what I mean? Patience and perseverance, right? Continues to be important for all of us. And so to see, some of the examples that you've lifted up in that regard is just inspiring.
Yeah, I'm curious what the critics will say. So I wrote a article about this on my Substack, and with the first book, The Color of Compromise, I mean, there were a lot of bad faith critiques, but one of the most frequent bad faith critiques was, well, this is selective history. It's one-sided. Um, and first of all history is selective. There's no such thing as objective history. Why? Because even the topic you choose is selective, and then the facts you choose to include or not include is selective. And every historian has a perspective. That's actually what makes history books interesting. They're making an argument. You're not just supposed to present 200 pages of a timeline. Nobody wants to read that. And it doesn't actually enlighten you very much. So just as an aside, there's no such thing as objective history. And it's not even necessarily the positive good that people think it is. So the critique was, well, it's not objective, right? And that's not the issue. The issue is what's your argument? And then what's the data and the facts that you use to prove it? And is it persuasive? And if not, you can't just say you don't like it. You're supposed to come with your own thesis, your own argument, and better evidence that's more persuasive. That's not what these folks did with The Color of Compromise. What they said with that was essentially they were mad that it was critiquing white Christians. And so they said it wasn't legitimate history because I was only telling, quote unquote, the bad parts. Well, so I'm curious what they'll say about the spirit of justice because these are, quote unquote, the good parts of Christian history. And when it comes to fighting racism, it just so happens that most of those stories are coming from Black Christians. So will they have an issue with that? Or what will they say now that the so-called other side is being told in this book, The Spirit of Justice? And I do include some white folks in there too, because that is part of the story. But yeah, it mostly centers on Black Christians. And I'm curious how they'll try to tear this book down or if it'll even be on their radar. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, that'll be interesting. I mean, to some degree, who cares? You know what I mean? For some of the kind of people, no matter what
It's
you
just
do,
fascinating to
no
me.
matter what you say, they're not going to accept it. But
Yeah,
I'm glad that you're open-minded about listening.
I just, to me, it's more curiosity and kind of this morbid fascination. Like, it's not like I'm worried what they'll say, but I'm like, how are they going to spin this? Because it's really interesting to me.
So I'd like to read one of the endorsements from the book. This is from one of our other author friends, Terence Lester, who says this: if you've been asking what keeps one's soul going in the face of white supremacy that threatens the very existence of those who have been marginalized and discriminated against, while navigating a world that seems apathetic toward the struggles and sufferings of others, then I believe Dr. Jemar Tisby has the answer for his time in his timely work. It's the strength of God and the spirit of justice. His words carry the spirit of those who fought injustice with nonviolence and resistance, revealing the enduring power of faith in overcoming centuries of systemic oppression. Dr. Tisby's work offers hope and a call to action for all who seek to embody that same spirit of justice to keep the work of justice alive. So it sounds like your book had quite an impact on Terrence, which is, great. What do you think about the book had that impact on him?
Well, first of all, I got to shout out my brother Terrence Lester. He is the founder of Love Beyond Walls. He is doing incredible work with houselessness. He's an activist and also an educator and also an award-winning author. So he's very gracious. He's also the only male I got to endorse it, or I wanted to. I was trying to be very intentional in the spirit of justice about highlighting and lifting up the work of Black women. And so you'll see every other endorsement is a Black woman on this book. But he made the cut, and he was generous to read it. I think what is resonating with people like Terrence Lester and others is the lesser known stories of Black Christians who were working for justice. I think sometimes it is easy to focus on the negative, on what is lacking, or, like I said before, people behaving badly. And we can overlook or forget the significance of the people who struggled for justice. We also, this is in the weeds, but it's really important. I learned this in grad school, this term, an impressionistic view of history. Impressionistic as in almost like art history and art critique, right? Where the artist will give a broad sketch or an impression of a subject. It's not super detailed or refined on first glance. And that's how we tend to look at history. We have an impression of, racism. We have an impression of activists, but we actually don't know the fine details. So I think just like with the color of compromise, with the spirit of justice, what really punches people in the gut, and hopefully in a good way, is the detail, the actual stories. So when you read about the fact that Myrlie Evers Williams wasn't just grieving her husband, but she was pregnant at the time of his assassination and she miscarried.
Mm,
And when you read from her autobiography that she considered taking her own life, even as a mother of her other children, she just felt like she couldn't go on. And then she said, something prevented me. And as an aside, a very important aside, she says, divine intervention, I'm sure.
mm, mm,
And that's so interesting. Like in the midst of all this grief and darkness and pain, she clung to her faith.
mm,
I think those stories and knowing the contours of them, the light and the shadows and the detail, that is what makes this book powerful. And it's not really even about this book. That's what makes history powerful. These are the stories of our humanity. And when you actually sit with people's experiences, even though they may be decades or centuries removed from your experience, when you learn about their humanity, their trials, their ups and downs, their emotions, their inner life, I think it builds empathy and compassion. And I think it leaves an indelible impression for those who are open to it.
So let's talk about that. I mean, as you know, Jamar, I have a tendency to say, okay, well, what do we do about it, right?
Uh,
You know, a lot of great books about analyzing an issue or looking at the history of an issue, and I realize your book is primarily, trying to uplift all these stories. But what do we do about it? Looking
yeah.
forward. I mean, what do you want people to take away from this in terms of how it affects their lives, what actions that they can take?
So I think all three of my books so far really fit together to answer that question. The Color of Compromise is essentially what's the problem? What's wrong? My second book, How to Fight Racism, is what do we do about it? Well, I'm so fired up about all this stuff. Now, how can I take action? Well, here's your practical book. But then you get into it and you start trying to work for justice and you realize, oh, this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And it's not a straight path to progress. It's a winding circular path. And sometimes it doubles back and you're moving backwards before you can
Yeah.
go forward, right? So how do you keep going, especially when it looks like you're not winning? And that's what the spirit of justice does. And so with the spirit of justice, the answer to that question, what do we do? The fundamental question is answering is how do you keep going? How do you still gain inspiration when the path is difficult, treacherous, winding, rocky, etc.? And rather than just like tell you, I wanted to show you through the real life true stories of people who did that very thing, who got knocked down, who endured, slavery, segregation, beatings, loss of jobs, property, all of that, and somehow kept going. And I think in reading those stories, we actually realize, hey, these are regular, everyday people for the most part. They had nothing special in their background that would say they're going to do these exceptional things. What they did was they took one step that required faith and courage. And then that built a little bit more confidence. And I took another step and another step and another step. That's the same thing we do too. I end the book with this chapter talking about four virtues. I was trying to say, we've seen these dozens of stories. What binds them together? Because they're all different parts of the country, all different eras of history, men and women, rich, poor, young, old, all that. What binds them together? I said there's at least four virtues. There are more, but these are the ones I focused on. Faith, courage, imagination, resilience. Faith, courage, imagination, resilience. I want to talk about what we do about it. We cultivate these virtues because I think it's vitally important that we focus not only on external changes, but internal changes. Not only on the kind of world we want to create, but the kind of people we must be to create that world. People of faith, people of courage, people of imagination, and people of resilience.
Um, One of the things that struck me about your book is the kind of timeliness of it. As you know,
Mm,
I've interviewed a lot of people of color, and authors, and a lot of them are tired,
mm.
of beating their head against the wall, so to speak, and not seeing the progress that they think is justified. So, do you think that, that's the primary audience for your book, is giving them, kind of the support and showing them the resilience and endurance of others?
I'm really glad you picked up on that, Brian, because that really is my heart behind the book is um, that this book would be sort of an oasis in a weary land. That as I was writing it, I was very cognizant of the fact that we're coming up on an election year, that even just politically speaking, let alone socially, economically, environmentally speaking, we're in a very precarious spot. And even now, as we record this, roughly 2 months before the election, we don't know what's going to happen. And what I keep telling people is election day in November is not the end of all of this. It's just the end of one part, and it's the beginning of another part that is perhaps even more unpredictable. So I'm very concerned about our longevity in this, because if we are hanging our hopes on a particular person getting elected, a particular policy getting passed, a law getting repealed, we can easily be very not only disappointed, but disillusioned. We can become cynical and even apathetic because we're basing all of it on an immediate result that's external that we hope to see, and that ultimately we don't have all the control over. I don't believe we're powerless, but there's no guarantee we're going to win is what I'm trying to say. And so then what do you do? Do you give up? Do you say, well, I tried, I marched once, or I posted about this, or, I put everything I had into this election and my candidate didn't win. So that's it for me. No, we remember people like Murray Evers Williams, who says there's something about the spirit of justice. It makes you determined all over again. So I want us
Mm.
to become determined all over again, each and every day, because that's what it takes to see justice roll down like water.
Well, as you said, it's a marathon. We need to keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
So I know you're in the midst of a book launch, but are there any future plans that you can talk about at this point?
I'm already drafting the next book. Fortunate to be under contract with Convergent Books, which is a
Oh,
division
good.
of Penguin Random House. And so that won't we're at the very beginning of the process. I haven't even turned in the first draft of the manuscript yet, but it's going to be a different book than I've done before. It'll be more of memoir, more of personal
Hmm.
stories. And so
Hmm.
you'll get a lot more detail about my life in white evangelical circles, the good,
Hmm.
the bad, the ugly, but with some lessons, with some wisdom gained from those scars and experiences. So that is what I'm working on. If folks are the praying type, I would love prayers to try to write in the midst of also launching one book and
Yeah.
trying to write the next one.
Well, good luck with that. We'll do another interview in a couple of years or whenever that
Yeah, that'll be a fun
comes
one.
available. Good, good. Well, again, the title of Jamar's new book is The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. Check it out on jamartisby.com. Jamar, congratulations on another outstanding book and on all the wonderful work that you do. And thanks so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Brian. Keep up the great work.